The first time I realized my mother thought she had already won was when the judge said the number out loud and she did not even flinch. $4.85 million. dollars. The words floated through the courtroom like something solid, heavy enough to land on my chest, and she only crossed her legs and folded her hands as if she were listening to a weather report. She leaned closer to me, her perfume sharp and familiar, and whispered that once this was over, I would sign everything over to her, because this was family money, and family knew how to handle things. I stared straight ahead at the paper in the judge's hands, at the thin edge of it trembling slightly as he read. He slowed down near the bottom. He always slowed down at the end. When I finally looked back at her, her smile had started to fade, just barely, like she had sensed something slipping before it fully fell. That was the moment I knew the last line on that page was not meant for me. It was meant for her. The courtroom smelled like old wood and recycled air, the kind of place where decisions were made quietly and lived with loudly. The bench pressed into the backs of my legs and my hands were clasped so tightly in my lap that my fingers had gone numb. Across the aisle, my mother sat with her attorney, her posture straight, her expression composed, her confidence so complete it felt rehearsed. She had chosen her outfit carefully, dark but expensive, respectful but powerful, the uniform of someone who expected to be taken seriously. She nodded occasionally as the judge spoke, as if she were approving of the process, as if this were something she supervised rather than endured. I sat alone at my table. No entourage, no whispering counsel leaning in to reassure me. That had been my choice. Or at least, that was what I told myself. The truth was, I did not want anyone else's breath in my ear while this was happening. I needed to hear every word for myself. I needed to know exactly what my grandfather had done. The judge's voice was steady, practiced, the voice of someone who had read hundreds of wills and knew how much damage could be done with a single paragraph. He moved through the formal language with efficiency, full name, date, declarations of sound mind and intent. I already knew most of it. I had read the document days earlier with the attorney, my eyes skimming the pages too quickly at first, then slowing when the reality of it sank in. I knew what my grandfather had left me. I knew what he had not left her. What I did not know, what no one had explained to me yet, was why my mother had still walked into this courtroom acting like the outcome was hers. She shifted beside her lawyer and glanced at me, her eyes sharp, assessing. There was no warmth in that look, no shared history or grief, just calculation. She mouthed the word relax, like she had when I was a teenager and she wanted me to stop asking questions. I did not respond. I focused on the paper again, on the faint crease near the bottom, on the place where the judge's finger paused as if he were deciding how best to proceed. This was not just about money. Not really. I could feel that in my bones. This was about control. About who would decide what my life looked like from this point on. My mother believed, with a certainty that bordered on faith, that she was entitled to manage anything that passed through my hands. She always had. Even now, even after years of distance and silence, she spoke as if my choices were temporary inconveniences she would eventually correct. I had grown up under that voice, the one that said, "Trust me, let me handle it. You are too young to understand." It had followed me into adulthood, into decisions about school and work and where I lived. It had faded when I pulled away, when I stopped calling as often, when I learned how to say no without explaining myself. But it had never disappeared completely. It had just waited. When my grandfather died, that voice came roaring back. She had been calm from the moment she arrived in town, efficient in a way that made people mistake her for supportive. She organized meals, contacted distant relatives, spoke to neighbors she barely remembered, all with the same measured tone. Every kindness came with a suggestion attached. Every offer of help came with a reminder that she had done this before, that she knew how these things worked. I let her talk. I let her believe I was overwhelmed enough to need her. It was easier than fighting her while I was still trying to breathe through the loss. Now she sat 10 feet away from me in a courtroom, convinced that whatever my grandfather had written would bend in her favor once she applied enough pressure. She had said as much the night before, her voice low and confident as she stood in the hotel hallway, telling me that after the judge was done, we would go somewhere private and sign what needed to be signed. I had nodded then too. I had learned a long time ago that my silence unsettled her more than any argument. The judge reached the section where my name appeared, and my stomach tightened. He read it carefully, each word deliberate. He spoke about the assets, the accounts, the house my grandfather had lived in for more than 40 years. The total value again, $4.85 million. This time my mother's fingers twitched in her lap. Her attorney leaned closer, whispering something I could not hear. She waved him off without looking, her eyes never leaving the judge. She believed this was the part where I became a problem to be solved. I knew she was already planning the next steps, the conversations about managing the estate, about protecting me from my own inexperience, about the paperwork she would bring out once we were alone. She had done it before, slipping documents across tables, presenting decisions as favors, turning resistance into guilt. She was good at it. She had built her life on being good at it. The judge continued reading, his tone unchanged. He did not look at her when he mentioned the amount designated for her, small enough to be almost insulting when set against the rest. That was when her composure cracked for the first time. It was subtle, a tightening around the mouth. A quick glance at her attorney. But it was there. I felt it then. A shift in the room, a slight imbalance like the moment before a chair tips over. I straightened in my seat without meaning to. My heartbeat sounded loud in my ears, too loud for a place like this. The judge reached the bottom of the page and paused. It was not a dramatic pause. Not the kind you see in movies. It was practical, almost courteous, like he wanted to make sure he read what came next correctly. He adjusted his glasses. He glanced at a note on the desk beside him. The paper rustled. My mother leaned back again, forcing a smile that did not quite settle into place. She tapped her foot once, an impatient rhythm I remembered from childhood car rides and closed office doors. Her lawyer whispered urgently now, his hand covering his mouth. She shook her head, a sharp movement, as if telling him to stop fussing. I watched her face instead of the judge. I watched the color drain from it as he began the final sentence. He did not finish it. Something about the opening words hit her before the meaning fully formed. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and for the first time since this hearing began, she looked afraid, not confused, not offended. Afraid. Her attorney's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered softly onto the table. He reached for it too late, his movement suddenly clumsy. My mother grabbed his sleeve, her nails digging into the fabric, her voice a harsh whisper I could not make out. She shook her head again, faster this time, like she could undo what was happening if she refused to hear it. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when something you have been bracing for finally arrives, even if you do not yet know its shape. Whatever my grandfather had written at the end of that document, it was not meant to be negotiated. It was not meant to be softened or explained away. It was meant to land. The judge looked up then, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering for just a moment on my mother and her attorney before returning to the page. His voice was steady, but there was something else in it now, a weight that had not been there before. Long before this morning, long before the courthouse steps and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, this war had already been decided. It had started years ago, in choices made and chances wasted, in phone calls unanswered and visits postponed. I had lived in the space those choices created. My mother had assumed she could still step into it and rearrange the furniture. The judge took a breath and lowered his eyes back to the paper. And that was where everything stopped. The judge's voice faded into a dull rhythm, not because he stopped speaking, but because my mind had already slipped somewhere else. The paper in his hands made a soft sound as he adjusted it, and that small rustle pulled me backward, the way a familiar smell can drag you into a room that no longer exists. Long before money learned how to speak so loudly, my life was divided into two quiet halves. One belonged to my grandfather, the other belonged to my mother. They never overlapped cleanly, not even when we all pretended they did. With my grandfather, life moved at a steady pace. Not exciting, not impressive, but solid. He lived in a modest house on a street where people waved because they recognized each other, not because they had something to prove. Mornings started early. He drank his coffee black at the small kitchen table by the window, the same table where he later taught me how to balance a checkbook and read bank statements without panicking. He did not talk much while he worked. He did not need to. His presence alone filled the space in a way that made you feel like nothing terrible could happen as long as you stayed there. When I came to live with him full-time, it was explained to me as a practical decision. My mother said it made sense. She said opportunities were pulling her in another direction, and that I would be better off with stability while she figured things out. She said all the right words. Temporary. Best for everyone. Just for now. I was old enough to hear them, but not old enough to understand what they left out. My grandfather never framed it that way. He never said your parents left you. He never said you were being passed off. He simply cleared out the spare room, moved my clothes into the dresser, and told me where he kept the extra blankets. On my first night there, he knocked on the door before coming in, asked if I needed anything, and left the light on in the hallway. That was how he showed love. Quietly, consistently. He showed up. That was the difference. When my parents forgot things, and they forgot often, my grandfather remembered. School plays, birthdays, parent-teacher meetings, even the day I walked across the stage to get my high school diploma. I still remember scanning the audience that day, searching for my mother's face out of habit, and finding my grandfather instead. He stood up when my name was called and clapped, like I had just done something extraordinary. Later, he took me out for lunch and told me he was proud of me, not for finishing school, but for sticking with something when it got hard. At the time, I thought that was just the way grandfathers were supposed to be. I did not understand how rare it was to be that steady. The other half of my life felt different. Louder. Faster. Less forgiving. When I visited my mother, everything revolved around what she was building next. A new job. A new investment. A new plan that required patience and understanding from everyone around her. She spoke about success like it was a moving target. Something you chased even if it meant leaving things behind. She was always tired. Always busy. Always promising that once things settled down, she would have more time. I learned early not to ask when that would be. She liked to tell people I was independent. She said it with pride, like she had taught me that way. What she meant was that I had learned not to need much from her. When I was upset, she told me to be rational. When I was disappointed, she told me to toughen up. She framed distance as a lesson. Dependence, she said, was a weakness. My grandfather never argued with her about it. He did not need to. He just let me be young when I was young, unsure when I was unsure, and tired when I was tired. He never treated my feelings like inconveniences. He listened. He remembered. The moment everything truly split happened quietly, the way most lasting damage does. My mother packed up her life and moved several states away. She stood in the doorway of my grandfather's house with her keys in her hand and told me this was not goodbye. She said it was just logistics. She hugged me, quick and tight, and promised to call every week. I nodded and told her I understood, because that was what I had learned to do. After her car disappeared down the street, my grandfather asked me what I wanted for dinner. That was it. No speeches, no explanations, just a question that assumed I was staying. I cried that night, quietly, with my face pressed into the pillow so he would not hear. In the morning, he made pancakes and acted like nothing was wrong. That was his gift. He never forced me to talk before I was ready. He just stayed close enough that I could. As I grew older, he began teaching me things that had nothing to do with emotions and everything to do with survival. He showed me how to read contracts, how to notice when someone avoided answering a simple question, how to pay attention to patterns instead of promises. Money is loud, he used to say, tapping the side of his head with one finger, but intentions speak louder. If you listen, people will tell you exactly who they are. At the time, I thought he was preparing me for adulthood. I did not realize he was preparing me for my own family. The last conversation we had before everything changed felt ordinary. That was what made it so cruel in hindsight. We were sitting at the kitchen table, eating soup from mismatched bowls, the late afternoon light slanting across the floor. He looked tired, more tired than usual, but his eyes were clear. He asked me about my plans, about what I wanted to do next. I told him I was still figuring it out. He nodded like that was a perfectly acceptable answer. Then he said, almost casually, that if anything ever happened to him, I should remember that I was not obligated to trust people just because they shared my blood. I laughed and told him he was being dramatic. He smiled and let it go. If I had known how close we were to the end, I would have held on to that moment longer. I would have memorized the way his voice sounded, the way his hands rested on the table, the way the house felt full even in silence. A sudden scrape of wood pulled me back to the present. Someone shifted on a bench behind me. The judge cleared his throat. The courtroom came back into focus, sharp and unforgiving. My chest tightened as I realized how far I had drifted. The inheritance was never just about money. It was about all the choices that led us here. About who stayed and who left. About the lessons that were taught and the ones that were ignored. I looked across the room again at my mother. She sat rigid now, her earlier confidence replaced by something brittle. For the first time, I wondered if she ever understood what she had lost when she walked away all those years ago. Not the house, not the money, but the chance to know the man who raised me when she did not. The judge adjusted the papers in his hands once more, his eyes scanning the page he had paused on. The room grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Whatever he was about to read next had its roots in all of this, in the years before the will, in the choices made long before anyone stepped into a courtroom. The phone rang before the sky had fully decided what color it wanted to be. That thin gray hour before morning, when the world feels suspended, was always my grandfather's favorite time of day. He used to say it was when things were honest, before noise and expectations rushed in. I was half awake when the sound cut through the quiet, sharp, and wrong, and before I even reached for it, something in my stomach dropped, as if it already knew. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, local to his town. My thumb hovered there longer than it should have. I remember thinking, absurdly, that if I waited a few more seconds, maybe whoever it was would hang up and the moment would pass. It did not. I answered, my voice still rough with sleep, and a man introduced himself, his tone careful and professional. He said my name to make sure he had the right person, and then he said he was calling from the hospital. He told me my grandfather had passed away during the night. The words did not hit all at once. They slid into me slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. I thanked him. I wrote down the details he gave me. I asked practical questions because that felt safer than asking emotional ones. When the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall across from me, listening to the hum of the heater kicking on and off. I did not cry. I did not scream. It felt like someone had reached inside me and turned a switch, dimming everything. The room looked the same. My hands were steady. My chest rose and fell the way it always had. Only the center of me felt hollow, like something essential had been quietly removed. I moved through the house without thinking, making coffee I did not drink, opening curtains that let in a light that felt too intrusive. His chair by the window sat empty. The mug he always used was still in the sink from the night before. Every object felt suddenly heavier, as if it carried more meaning than it had an hour earlier. The first person I should have called was my mother. That was the rule, the script, the expectation. Instead, I stood there for a long time with my phone in my hand, staring at her name in my contacts like it belonged to someone else. Calling her meant opening a door I had kept mostly closed for years. It meant inviting her back into a space she had chosen to leave. I thought about the last real conversation we had shared. It had been years ago, tense and brief. She had told me she could not help with tuition because she and her husband had other priorities. The next day, she posted photos online from a resort I had never even heard of. When I brought it up later, she said I was being unfair, that I did not understand adult finances. That was when I learned how easily she could make me feel small for needing anything at all. Still, she was my mother. Or at least, she had been once. I pressed call before I could change my mind. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and alert, as if it were the middle of the day instead of barely morning. She said my name with an enthusiasm that felt disconnected from reality, asked how I was doing, asked what was new. For a moment, I wondered if I had misdialed. I told her. I said Grandpa passed away last night. There was a pause, short but noticeable, the sound of someone recalculating. Then she gasped softly and said, "That was terrible. That she was so sorry. That she knew how close we were." Her sympathy landed a beat too late, like applause after the music had stopped. She said she and her husband would come right away. She said they would help me handle everything. The word everything stood out, heavy and deliberate. She repeated it twice, as if it were reassurance, as if it were a promise. I murmured something non-committal and ended the call as quickly as I could without making it obvious. When the screen went dark, the house felt different. Not quieter, but watched. I realized then that grief was not the only thing settling in my chest. Beneath it, coiled and alert, was a sense of dread I could not fully explain yet. I spent the rest of the morning packing a bag for the trip back to his town, my movements mechanical. Every folded shirt felt like a small betrayal, like I was already dismantling a life that had not even had time to be mourned. I drove with the radio off, my thoughts looping between memories of him and the sound of my mother's voice saying everything. By the time I arrived, the house looked exactly the same and completely unfamiliar. Neighbors had left notes on the door. Someone had dropped off a casserole wrapped in foil. I let myself inside and stood there for a moment, keys still in my hand, unsure where to put my grief. The days before my mother arrived blurred together. I contacted the funeral home. I spoke to his doctor. I answered calls from people who had known him for decades, each conversation another reminder of how much space he had filled. At night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same one where he used to drink his coffee, and tried to imagine the world without him in it. I thought about calling my mother again. I did not. She called me instead. Once to confirm travel plans, once to ask about the house, once to ask if I had found any important documents. The questions came quickly. stacked on top of each other, framed as concern but edged with something sharper. I answered vaguely, instinctively holding details back. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself she was just trying to help. Still, I slept poorly. On the morning they were due to arrive, I cleaned the living room even though it was already clean. I folded blankets he had folded 100 times. I straightened picture frames that did not need it. I was still holding one of his old flannel shirts when I heard tires crunching on the gravel outside. The car that pulled up looked expensive and out of place, glossy and confident against the muted tones of the neighborhood. My mother stepped out first, heels sinking slightly into the ground, her black coat tailored and crisp. She looked composed, put together, the picture of controlled grief. Her husband followed, carrying a briefcase and his phone, already scanning the house like he was assessing a property. She called my name with a softness that did not quite reach her eyes and wrapped her arms around me before I could react. Her perfume hit me immediately, sharp and familiar, a scent I had once associated with comfort and now only linked to obligation. She murmured condolences into my hair, told me she was sorry, told me she knew this must be hard. Her husband nodded at me and said he was sorry for my loss, his tone polite and distant. He did not look at the house with sadness. He looked at it with interest. We went inside, and for a few minutes, we moved around each other carefully, like actors feeling out a stage. My mother touched objects she barely remembered, commenting on memories that felt borrowed. She sighed at photographs she had not been in. Her husband stayed quiet, his eyes lingering on details I had never paid attention to before. Then the questions started again. Not all at once, just enough to slip past politeness. Had the attorney been in touch? Did Grandpa leave instructions? Was there a will? Each question landed like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading outward. I answered cautiously. I said there would be a reading in a few days. I said I did not know much yet. I said we could talk about it later. My mother smiled and said of course. She said the most important thing was that I was protected. She said people could take advantage of someone in my position. Girls my age, she added. Like that explained everything. That night, after they left for their hotel, I sat alone again at the kitchen table and replayed every word. Her pauses, her phrasing, the way her husband had leaned forward when money came up, the way she kept saying everything like it belonged to her already. Grief had opened the door. I had made the call. Now she was back in my life, moving quickly, confidently, as if this were an opportunity she had been waiting for. I stared at the empty chair across from me and thought about my grandfather's voice, about his warnings, about the way he always told me to pay attention when people showed their intentions. Outside, the night settled in, quiet and watchful, and I knew that whatever came next would not be simple. The house felt like it was holding its breath while I waited. I was folding one of my grandfather's blankets on the couch, smoothing the edges the way he always had, when the sound of tires on gravel drifted through the front window. It was sharp and wrong against the quiet of the street. I did not have to look to know it was them. The car that pulled up did not belong here. It was sleek and polished, the kind of car people bought to signal success to strangers. It sat in my grandfather's driveway like a visitor who had missed the point of the place entirely. When the engine cut off, the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. My mother stepped out first. Her black coat fit her perfectly, tailored in a way that suggested planning rather than spontaneity. Her heels sank slightly into the gravel, and she adjusted her balance without missing a beat. She looked composed, controlled, the image of grief as she believed it should be presented. Her husband followed a moment later, briefcase in one hand, phone in the other, already glancing toward the house like he was taking inventory. I was still holding the blanket when she opened the door. She said my name softly and wrapped her arms around me before I could move. The hug was tight and practiced, ending almost as soon as it began. Her perfume hit me immediately, sharp and unmistakable. I felt myself stiffen, then relax out of habit. She told me she was so sorry. She said she knew how close my grandfather and I had been. Her voice was steady, sympathetic in the way someone sounded when they knew exactly what to say. I nodded and said thank you, because that was what the moment required. Her husband offered condolences next, his tone polite and distant. He did not look at my face when he said it. His eyes moved past me, scanning the living room, the furniture, the framed photos on the wall. It was not grief that drove his gaze. It was interest. We went inside, and the house seemed to shrink around us. The quiet that had felt comforting hours earlier now felt crowded. My mother moved through the rooms slowly, touching picture frames and knickknacks as if reacquainting herself with memories she had not bothered to maintain. She commented on how much the place had not changed, how my grandfather always liked things a certain way. She sighed at the right moments, her grief carefully measured. Her husband stayed mostly silent, taking everything in. When he spoke, it was to ask neutral questions about logistics, how long I planned to stay, whether the neighbors had been helpful. Small talk that felt like filler, like he was waiting for his turn. For a few minutes, it almost felt normal. Almost. Then the shift came, subtle but unmistakable, like a change in air pressure. He lowered himself into my grandfather's favorite armchair, the one by the window, and crossed his legs. He asked casually whether anyone had mentioned a will yet. The question landed in the room with a weight that made my chest tighten. I said I did not know much yet. I told him the attorney had called and said there would be a reading in a few days. My voice sounded careful even to my own ears. My mother and her husband exchanged a look. It was quick, gone in a heartbeat, but I saw it. Sharp, alert, alive. She said that was good. She said my grandfather had been very comfortable financially, and that it was important everything was handled properly. The word properly lingered, heavy with meaning. Her husband leaned forward then, his elbows resting on his knees. He said, handling a large estate was complicated. He talked about taxes and investments and legal risks. He said I was young, that I did not have the experience to manage that kind of responsibility on my own. I felt my jaw tighten. I said my grandfather had taught me a lot about money. I said he trusted me. My mother placed her hand over mine smoothly, cutting me off before I could say more. She said that trust was wonderful, but it did not replace experience. She talked about the businesses they had built, the decisions they had made. She said it would be smarter for them to manage things for me, at least for now. The translation was clear. Let us have control. I pulled my hand back gently and said, we did not even know what my grandfather had left yet. I asked if we could focus on planning his funeral first. The annoyance flashed across her face before she smoothed it away. She said, of course. She said she just wanted to make sure I was protected. She said people could take advantage of girls in my position. Girls in my position. As if she had not been the first person to walk away when I needed her. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through logistics, calling the funeral home, choosing a date, making a list of people to notify. Every time money came up, flowers, reception costs, travel expenses, my mother said the estate would cover it. She said it easily, confidently, like the decision had already been made. Her husband nodded along, occasionally adding comments about efficiency and planning. I listened, answered where necessary, and kept my thoughts to myself. The more they spoke, the clearer the pattern became. When they finally left to check into their hotel, the house exhaled. I locked the door behind them and stood there for a moment, my forehead resting against the wood. My body felt tired in a way sleep would not fix. I went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with a cup of tea that slowly went cold. My grandfather's chair sat empty across from me. I could almost hear his voice, steady and calm, reminding me to pay attention. I replayed the afternoon in my head. The timing of the question about the will, the language they used: manage, handle, protect. The look they shared when they thought I was not watching. None of it felt accidental. They had not come to stand beside me in my grief. They had come to see what they could take. The funeral was held 2 days later in the small chapel my grandfather had attended for decades. The sky hung low and gray, pressing against the windows. People filtered in quietly, neighbors and old friends, faces I recognized from years of shared routines. They came with stories, with simple condolences, with hands that squeezed mine like they meant it. My parents arrived late. My mother walked in wearing a perfectly fitted black dress, her makeup flawless, her expression composed. She took her seat in the front row beside her husband, close enough to look devoted, far enough from me that I could pretend not to notice her checking her phone between hymns. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled as I stepped up to the front. I had written something down, folded and unfolded the paper so many times the creases were nearly worn through. But when I opened my mouth, the words that came out were not the ones I had prepared. I spoke about my grandfather's consistency, about how he measured family by who showed up, not by blood, about integrity and quiet kindness. I said he believed money revealed who people already were, it did not change them. I said he taught me to stand up for myself, even if that meant standing alone. I did not look at my mother while I spoke, but I felt her attention sharpen. The air around her felt tight, charged. After the service, people gathered in small clusters, sharing memories. I was talking to one of my grandfather's old friends when I heard raised voices nearby. My mother and her husband stood a few steps away, their tones low but tense. Her husband said she was overreacting. He said once the will was read, they would get it sorted. My mother hissed back that what if everything was left to me? She said my grandfather had never forgiven them for past decisions. She sounded scared, not sad. He said they would contest it. He talked about claiming undue influence, mental decline. He said judges hated seeing that much money go to someone so young. He said they could paint me as unstable. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and made sure they saw me. I said quietly that my friends were still there. I said if they were going to talk about me like I was not in the room, they could at least wait until they left the building. My mother's face flushed. She said that was not what it was. She said they were worried about me. She said these decisions were complicated. I told her that was exactly what I was trying to avoid. We stared at each other, the space between us filled with years of unspoken resentment. Her husband finally said they would meet with the attorney the next day and get clarity. He said then they would make decisions together. Together. The word felt hollow. I nodded once, more to end the conversation than to agree, and turned away. I went back to the people who had actually known my grandfather, who had shown up for him in life, not just in death. By the time the last car pulled out of the parking lot, my grief had hardened into something else. Not anger exactly, awareness. If my parents wanted to turn my grandfather's legacy into a battlefield, they were about to find out I was not the quiet child they had left behind. I had learned too much, and I was done pretending not to see what was coming. That night, as I lay awake listening to the house settle around me, I knew the next meeting with the attorney would not be a formality. It would be the first real move in a war my mother had already decided to fight. The attorney's office was quieter than I expected, the kind of quiet that felt intentional rather than empty. The walls were lined with shelves of thick books whose titles I did not bother reading. Everything in the room seemed designed to remind you that words mattered here, that once spoken or written, they could not be taken back. I sat in the chair across from the desk with my hands folded in my lap, aware of how small the space felt compared to the weight of what I had carried in with me. I had come alone. My mother had offered to come with me, had said it would be easier if we handled things together. I told her I needed some time, that I wanted to hear everything first. She did not argue, but her smile had tightened in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The attorney introduced himself and expressed his condolences in a tone that felt practiced but sincere enough. He spoke about my grandfather with respect, not just as a client but as a man he had known for years. That detail mattered to me more than I expected. It grounded me. It reminded me that my grandfather had not been navigating all of this alone. He explained the basics of the estate process, the timelines, the formal steps that would follow: probate, notifications, appraisals. I listened carefully, nodding when appropriate, but my mind kept circling back to my parents sitting in the chapel whispering about contesting the will. I wondered how many times this man had seen families tear themselves apart over money that had once seemed abstract. I assumed that was all we were here to discuss: the will, the reading, the logistics, confirmation of what I already knew, and a schedule for what came next. I braced myself for the moment he would say the words out loud: the amount, the imbalance, the reality of what my grandfather had chosen to do. Instead, he paused and reached for a folder that was thinner than the others stacked neatly beside him. He did not slide it across the desk. He kept it in front of himself, his hand resting on the cover as if he were deciding how much to reveal. He said my grandfather had left more than one document. He said the will was the primary instrument, the one that would be read publicly and entered into record. But there was something else. Not a will. Not legally binding in the same way. A memorandum, he called it. A letter of intent. I frowned, unsure what that meant. He explained that it was a document my grandfather had written to clarify his thinking, to explain his decisions in his own words. It was meant to guide interpretation if questions arose. It was not something that was typically shared unless necessary. I felt a strange mix of comfort and unease. Comfort in knowing my grandfather had been thorough. Unease in realizing he had anticipated questions, challenges, maybe even attacks. The attorney said my grandfather had been very clear-eyed when he wrote it. He had not been confused or emotional. He had been deliberate. He had spoken openly about family dynamics, about past behavior, about concerns that had grown over time. He had wanted there to be no doubt about why he made the choices he did. I asked if I could read it. The attorney hesitated, then said parts of it, yes. Other parts, not yet. He opened the folder and turned a few pages toward me. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, precise. My grandfather's voice seemed to rise off the paper as I read. He wrote about responsibility, about trust, about patterns he had observed, and choices he had made accordingly. He did not name my mother directly in the section I saw, but he did not need to. The references were clear enough. He wrote about pressure, about how often generosity was mistaken for obligation, about how easily help could turn into expectation. He wrote that he wanted his estate to support independence, not enable control. My throat tightened as I read. This was not a man acting on impulse. This was someone who had been paying attention for a long time. I looked up and asked what the parts were that I was not supposed to see yet. The attorney did not answer immediately. He closed the folder gently and said those sections addressed contingencies, conditions, situations that might arise depending on how certain people behaved after my grandfather's death. He said it was not about punishment, it was about protection. He said my grandfather had been very specific about timing, that some things were only meant to be disclosed if certain lines were crossed. I felt a pulse of frustration. I had already watched my parents whisper about discrediting me, about dragging this into court. It felt unfair to be kept in the dark when I was the one standing in the middle of it. The attorney met my gaze steadily and said knowledge was power, but timing was strategy. He said my grandfather had trusted him to know when to speak and when to wait. He said that trust had not been given lightly. When I left the office, the air outside felt colder than it had when I arrived. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the folder with the pages I had been allowed to read tucked under my arm, and tried to steady my breathing. My mother was waiting for me in the car down the block. She stepped out as soon as she saw me, her expression carefully neutral. She asked how it went, her tone light, as if this were just another errand. I told her it was informative. I told her the attorney had explained the process and the timeline. I told her the reading would happen as scheduled. She asked if there was anything else. Her eyes searched my face, looking for something she could use. I said no. And for the first time, I felt the weight of that word settle comfortably in my chest. She studied me for a moment longer, then smiled and said good. She said we would talk more later, when things were less overwhelming. She said she was proud of me for handling so much so well. The praise slid off me without sticking. That night, back at the house, I reread the pages my grandfather had written until the words blurred together. I thought about how carefully he had chosen them, how intentionally he had left some things unsaid, waiting for the right moment. I thought about my mother's confidence, the way she spoke as if the outcome were already decided. I thought about the look she had shared with her husband when the will came up. None of it felt spontaneous anymore. She had a plan. Or she thought she did. I folded the pages and placed them back into the folder, then tucked it into a drawer I knew my mother would not open. For the first time, I understood that information itself could be a boundary, that silence could be a form of self-defense. I did not tell her about the memorandum. I did not tell her that my grandfather had seen this coming. I did not tell her that the ground beneath her confidence was already shifting. Instead, I went to bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, the creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, ordinary noises that felt oddly reassuring. Somewhere between waking and sleep, I realized that the next time my mother made a move, it would not be from ignorance. It would be from intention. And whatever she chose to do next would decide when the rest of my grandfather's words finally came into the light. The call came the next afternoon while I was sorting through a box of old photographs at the dining room table. I almost let it go to voicemail because I did not recognize the number, but something in me hesitated, the same quiet instinct that had been nudging me for days. I answered, and a woman introduced herself as a cousin of my grandfather. Someone I had met only a handful of times at holidays long ago. She said she had heard about his passing and wanted to check on me. Her voice was gentle, unhurried. She said a few of them were getting together that evening and wondered if I would like to join them. Not a formal gathering, just coffee, conversation. She said they thought it might help. I stared down at the photograph in my hand, a faded picture of my grandfather standing beside a fishing boat, smiling into the sun. I said yes before I could overthink it. We met at a small cafe just off the main road, the kind of place my grandfather used to favor because it did not try too hard. When I walked in, I recognized more faces than I expected. A few relatives I barely knew. A couple of old friends of his. People who had known him in ways I never had, before I became the center of his world. They greeted me quietly, warmly, without the performative sympathy I had been bracing myself for. Someone slid a cup of coffee toward me without asking how I took it. Someone else squeezed my shoulder in passing. No one rushed me. No one asked about the will. At first, the conversation stayed safely on the surface. Stories about my grandfather's stubborn habits, the way he never replaced anything until it was completely worn out. The time he drove 3 hours to return a wallet to someone he had never met. I smiled where appropriate, laughed when the memory called for it. It felt good to hear him spoken about like this, whole and real, not reduced to a set of legal documents. Eventually, the conversation shifted, not abruptly, but naturally, the way truths often do when enough trust has settled into a room. Someone mentioned my mother, not unkindly, just in passing, a comment about how complicated things had always been. Another person nodded and added that my grandfather had tried, really tried, to keep the peace for years. I did not say anything. I let them talk. They spoke about loans he had given that were never repaid, about business ventures he had advised against that my mother pursued anyway, about promises made and quietly forgotten, about the strain it had put on him, not just financially, but emotionally. One woman said my grandfather used to worry about how easily my mother equated love with access. She said he hated feeling like his help came with expectations attached. I felt a strange mix of validation and sadness settle over me. These were not stories I had imagined or exaggerated. They were patterns, long-standing, observed by people who had nothing to gain from telling them. Someone else leaned in and said my grandfather had talked often about me, about how proud he was, about how relieved he felt knowing I had learned to stand on my own, about how determined he was not to let history repeat itself. That was when it clicked. Not in a dramatic way, quietly, like a puzzle piece settling into place. My mother's confidence, her urgency, the way she had assumed control without waiting to be invited. It was not new behavior. It was escalation. After a while, one of my grandfather's oldest friends asked if I would step outside with him. We stood near the edge of the parking lot, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the pavement. He looked at me with a seriousness that made my chest tighten. He said he did not want to alarm me, but I should be careful. He said my mother did not back down easily when she believed something was owed to her. He said my grandfather had worried about that, especially when it came to me. He told me to make sure I had good legal guidance, to keep things documented, to trust my instincts even when guilt tried to talk over them. I thanked him, my throat tight. I did not tell him how closely his warning echoed the lessons my grandfather had already drilled into me. When I left the cafe, the air felt clearer. Not lighter exactly, but sharper. I drove back to the house with the windows down, replaying everything I had heard. The stories overlapped too neatly with what I had already seen to ignore. My mother and her husband were in the living room when I returned. They were seated close together on the couch, their heads bent toward each other in quiet conversation that stopped as soon as I walked in. My mother looked up and smiled, asking how it went, if it was nice to see everyone. I said it was, and meant it. As the evening went on, I noticed things I might have brushed past before. The way my mother watched me when I spoke. The way her husband deferred to her with small nods before saying anything of substance. The way their questions circled the same topics again and again. Finances, timelines, documents, without ever landing directly. I answered carefully. I offered nothing extra. Later, alone in my room, I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the house quiet around me. I thought about the people at the cafe, about the consistency of their stories, about how none of them seemed surprised by the idea of conflict. Family, I realized, was not just the people who shared my last name. It was the people who had seen the truth up close and still cared enough to warn me. I slept better that night than I had in days. In the morning, my mother mentioned casually that she and her husband might stop by the attorney's office later in the week, just to ask a few questions. She said it like an afterthought, like something already agreed upon. I nodded and said we would see. Inside, something steadied. The fear that had been tightening my chest since the funeral began to loosen, replaced by a clearer understanding of what I was facing. This was not about grief. It was not about confusion. It was about entitlement meeting resistance for the first time. As I watched my mother gather her things, already planning her next move, I understood that whatever came next would not be a misunderstanding to resolve. It would be a line drawn, and this time, I would not be the one stepping back. The calm that settled over the house the next morning felt staged, like the quiet before a storm everyone pretends not to see coming. My mother moved through the kitchen with an ease that did not match the tension I could feel tightening the air. She made coffee, set out plates, even hummed softly as if we were settling into some ordinary rhythm. Her husband sat at the table scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing up to catch her eye. They shared small looks, quick nods, the kind of silent communication that comes from planning together. I watched them from the counter, my hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. Something about the way my mother smiled that morning put me on edge. It was too smooth, too careful. The sharpness I had grown used to seeing in her eyes was tucked away, replaced by a warmth that felt rehearsed. She asked if I had slept well. She asked if I was eating enough. She asked if I felt overwhelmed. Each question landed gently, but together they formed a pattern I recognized. This was how she spoke when she wanted something. After breakfast, she suggested we sit down together in the living room. She said there were a few things we should talk through while we had a quiet moment. Her tone was reasonable, almost soothing. I nodded and followed her, my stomach tight. She sat across from me on the couch, crossing her legs and smoothing her skirt. Her husband took the armchair nearby, placing his phone face down on the table like he was ready for a meeting. The house felt smaller with all of us arranged like this, the walls closing in. She began by talking about how proud she was of how I had handled everything. She said she knew this was a lot to carry at my age. She said my grandfather would be so proud of me. She reached out and touched my hand, holding it just long enough to make the gesture feel intentional. Then she mentioned paperwork. She said it casually at first, like an afterthought. She said the attorney would be sending documents soon, and that there was one in particular she wanted to discuss. She said it was nothing complicated, just a temporary authorization, a way for her to help manage things while everything settled. She pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the coffee table between us. She said it was for my protection. She said it would make things easier. She said it would allow her to handle the details so I could focus on healing. Her husband leaned forward and added that it was standard. He said people in my position often signed something like this. He said it would save time and prevent mistakes. I picked up the folder and opened it. The paper inside was crisp, the language dense and precise. I read slowly, line by line, the way my grandfather had taught me. My heart began to race as the meaning settled in. It was not temporary. Not really. It granted broad authority. Financial decisions. Legal decisions. The ability to act on my behalf without further consent. There was language about extensions, about discretion, about circumstances that could justify continued control. I looked up at my mother. Her expression was calm, expectant. I asked how long it would last. She said just until things were sorted out. She said we could revisit it later. I asked what happened if I wanted to revoke it. Her husband answered that there were procedures, but it would complicate things. He said it would be better to trust the process. Trust. The word landed hard. I closed the folder and set it back on the table. I took a breath and said I was not comfortable signing anything like that. The shift was immediate. My mother blinked, her smile faltering for a split second before she recovered. She laughed lightly and said I was overthinking it. She said I was emotional right now, and that was understandable. She said this was not the time to make things harder than they needed to be. Her husband's tone changed. He said this was not about comfort. He said it was about responsibility. He said if something went wrong because I refused help, it would be on me. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears, but I kept my voice steady. I said no. I said I appreciated their concern, but I would not sign it. My mother's hand tightened on the arm of the couch. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. She said I was being naive. She said I had no idea how quickly things could spiral if I made the wrong decision. She said my grandfather had sheltered me too much. That was when the mask slipped. She said I owed her. She said she was my mother. She said she had sacrificed things I would never understand. She said it was unfair for me to shut her out now. After everything. Her husband backed her without hesitation. He said families shared burdens. He said my refusal looked bad. He said other people would not understand why I was pushing away help. I sat there listening, feeling the familiar weight of guilt try to settle on my chest. The old urge to apologize rose up, sharp and insistent. For a moment, I saw myself at 12 years old, standing in a doorway, promising to do better just to keep the peace. But something in me had changed. I said I was not shutting her out. I said I was making a decision about my own life. I said I would not discuss legal matters without my attorney present. Her eyes hardened. She said that was unnecessary. She said bringing lawyers into everything was how families fell apart. I said quietly that families fell apart when boundaries were ignored. The room went silent. She stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she stood abruptly, the calm she had been performing all morning gone. She said I was making a mistake. She said she hoped I was prepared for the consequences of pushing her away. Her husband gathered the folder and slid it back into her bag. He looked at me with something like disappointment, as if I had failed an unspoken test. They left without another word. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the house. I sat there for a long moment, my hands trembling despite my efforts to stay composed. My heart felt like it was trying to climb out of my chest. I walked to the window and watched them get into the car. My mother's movements were sharp now, angry. She spoke quickly to her husband, her hands slicing through the air. He nodded, his jaw clenched. As the car pulled away, a strange mix of fear and clarity washed over me. I knew this was not the end. I knew she would not accept this quietly. But I also knew something else. I had said no. Clearly. Without apology. That line, once crossed, could not be erased. I stood alone in the living room, the folder still sitting on the table like a discarded weapon, and felt the weight of what I had just done settle into place. The war had shifted. Persuasion had failed. Whatever came next would not be disguised as help. The envelope arrived 3 days later, slipped halfway into the mailbox like it had every right to be there. I almost missed it because I was carrying groceries and thinking about nothing more serious than whether I had remembered to buy coffee. The return address caught my eye first. County Clerk. Legal Department. My stomach tightened before I even tore it open. I stood there in the driveway with the paper bag cutting into my arm and unfolded the documents with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. The language was stiff and formal, full of words designed to keep emotion out of it. My name appeared again and again in bold print. Not as a beneficiary, not as an heir, as a party to a claim. For a moment, none of it made sense. It was not about the will, not directly. It referenced a limited liability company I barely recognized, one my grandfather had been involved with years earlier. There were allegations of mismanagement, of breach of duty, of financial responsibility passing to me as the successor interest holder. My heart started to pound. I reread the first page, then the second, then the third. Each sentence seemed to pull the ground out from under me a little more. This was not grief talking. This was not confusion. This was an attack. I dropped the groceries on the kitchen counter and sat down hard in one of the chairs, The papers spread out in front of me like evidence at a crime scene. My mind raced through recent conversations, through the way my mother had looked at me when I refused to sign the authorization, through her parting words about consequences. This was not coincidence. I called my attorney immediately. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm for what I was feeling. He told me to bring everything to his office right away. The drive felt longer than usual. Every red light felt personal. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my hands were shaking. He read through the documents carefully, his expression tightening as he went. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He said this was not about accountability. He said this was leverage. He explained that the company in question had been dormant for years, that my grandfather had stepped away from active involvement long before his death, that any claim like this would require aggressive interpretation of succession clauses, interpretation that did not happen by accident. I asked him if my mother could be behind it. He did not hesitate before saying yes. He said the timing was too precise, the structure too convenient. He said whoever filed this knew exactly where to apply pressure. This was not about winning on the merits. This was about forcing me into a position where I would have to negotiate. The fear that surged through me then was sharp and disorienting. Not fear of losing money, fear of losing control of my own life, of being painted publicly as incompetent or irresponsible, of having my name tied to something ugly before I ever had a chance to build anything of my own. I asked him what could happen if it moved forward. He said best case, it would be dismissed after months of stress and legal fees. Worst case, it could damage my credibility and complicate the estate process significantly. I felt my throat tighten. This was what my mother had meant. Not threats shouted in anger. This, quiet, strategic, filed in triplicate. My attorney told me something then that shifted the air in the room. He said my grandfather had anticipated this kind of move. He said there were protections in place, structures that had not been relevant until now. He said the claim itself might trigger provisions designed to contain exactly this scenario. He did not go into detail. He said it was not time yet. He said, we needed to let this unfold carefully. I left his office with instructions not to respond publicly, not to call my mother, not to explain myself to anyone. Silence, he said, was not weakness. It was restraint. Back at the house, the quiet felt different. Not peaceful. Watchful. I set the papers on the table and stared at them until the words blurred. My phone buzzed once. A message from my mother. She asked if everything was okay. She said she had heard there might be some issues with the estate. She said she was worried about me. I did not respond. That night, sleep came in fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw legal language scrolling behind my lids. I imagined headlines, whispers. My grandfather's name dragged into something he would have hated. By morning, something else had taken hold alongside the fear. Anger, clean and focused. She had not come to me directly. She had not argued her case. She had gone around me, aiming for the one place she knew would hurt the most. My future. I thought about calling her, about demanding an explanation, about telling her to stop. The urge rose up hot and insistent. I let it pass. Over the next few days, the situation expanded quietly. My attorney fielded inquiries. Documents were requested. Timelines were established. Everything moved according to procedure, cold and methodical. Friends called, having heard vague rumors. I told them nothing. I learned how to deflect without lying, how to say it was being handled without offering details. Inside, the fear still flared unexpectedly. In the shower, in the grocery store, late at night when the house creaked and settled. But beneath it, something steadier was forming. My grandfather had not left me unprotected. He had not been naive. He had built this knowing exactly who might come after me and how. The realization did not make me brave. It made me patient. One afternoon, I found myself standing in his old workshop, running my fingers along the edge of his workbench. I thought about how carefully he had planned everything in his life, how little he wasted, how rarely he reacted impulsively. This was not a fight to win with emotion. It was a sequence to let play out. When my mother called again, I let it go to voicemail. Her message was different this time. Tighter. Less warm. She said she did not understand why I was making things difficult. She said we could still resolve this privately if I was willing to be reasonable. I deleted it without replying. Whatever line she thought she could force me across no longer mattered. She had already crossed one of her own. The next hearing was scheduled quietly, folded into a calendar full of things that pretended to be normal. Laundry, bills, meals. Life continued, even as something larger moved beneath the surface. I went to bed that night knowing I was no longer just defending an inheritance. I was defending my name, my autonomy, the right to choose who had access to me. The war had changed shape. And somewhere ahead, the final line my grandfather had written was waiting for the exact moment it was meant to be read. 2 mornings later, my attorney called and asked me to come in, not with urgency in his voice, but with something more deliberate, like he was choosing every word before it left his mouth. He said we had received additional materials related to the claim, and he wanted me to understand what we were actually dealing with. He did not say it would be okay. He said it would be clear. I drove to his office with my hands at 10 and 2, the way I did when I was trying to keep myself from shaking. The streets looked normal. People walked dogs. A woman carried a bouquet of grocery store flowers. The world kept moving as if nothing had changed, which somehow made everything feel more unreal. When I walked in, the receptionist greeted me softly and handed me a bottle of water, like she had done it 100 times for people walking into bad news. The waiting room smelled like lemon cleaner and printer ink. I sat for less than a minute before my attorney opened the door and waved me back. His office looked the same as it always had: clean desk, neat stacks of folders, framed certificates on the wall. But his posture was different. He was not in reaction mode anymore. He was in explanation mode. That shift alone made my stomach tighten. He asked me to sit. He slid a single folder across the desk, thicker than the last, and rested his hand on it for a moment before opening it. He said what my mother had triggered was not just a nuisance lawsuit. It was a move connected to something your grandfather built years ago, something most people would never think to connect to an inheritance at all. I frowned and asked what he meant. He began with the company name, the same one from the legal notice, the one that had looked like meaningless letters to me when I first read it. He said your grandfather did not just invest money there, he helped create the operating agreement. He helped design the rules that controlled what happened when someone tried to seize power through technicalities. I stared at him, trying to keep up. I told him I did not even know my grandfather was involved at that level. He nodded and said, "Most people did not." That was the point. Your grandfather did not like attention on his leverage. He liked it quiet. He liked it waiting. He explained that the company had been formed decades ago around a piece of property and a set of contracts tied to a family business arrangement. Not the kind of family business my mother bragged about, but the kind built on handshake deals and long relationships. Over the years, the group shifted. People retired. Interests transferred. Laws changed. But your grandfather stayed in the background, keeping one thing intact: the controlling language in the agreement. He paused to make sure I was still with him, then said the key detail. My grandfather had kept a specific class of authority tied to his interest, not a pile of cash, but the power to approve certain actions, the power to block certain transfers, and most importantly, the power to assign responsibility if someone tried to force control through coercion or fraud. I felt my throat go dry. I asked if that was even legal. He said legal and intentional. He said your grandfather had drafted it with professionals, updated it when needed, and stored the supporting documents with his estate planning materials. He said it was designed to protect people who operated in good faith and to expose anyone who tried to exploit loopholes like weapons. I sat back slowly, the chair creaking under me. My mind jumped to my mother's sudden interest in paperwork, her insistence on managing things, the way she framed control as protection. It had never been about helping me. It had been about getting her hands on whatever she suspected was buried under the surface. I asked how she even knew this existed. My attorney's mouth tightened. He said she probably did not know the full shape of it. She likely knew enough to feel threatened. That awareness alone would explain her urgency. People like her, he said carefully, moved fastest when they sensed a door might close. I did not correct him for saying people like her. I knew what he meant. He flipped to a page in the folder and tapped a section highlighted in pale yellow. He said, "The claim filed against you is structured in a way that tries to pull you into a fiduciary role you never accepted. If they can convince a judge you are responsible, they can pressure you into signing control away as a settlement strategy. It is a trap. Not because they expect to win outright, but because they expect you to panic." My stomach turned. I pictured my mother saying we could resolve this privately if I was willing to be reasonable. Reasonable had always meant surrender. He said your grandfather anticipated that too. He said there is a provision connected to succession that activates if anyone attempts to gain control of your inherited interest through coercive legal tactics. Not ordinary disputes, not good faith disagreement, coercion, bad faith, pressure campaigns designed to force transfer of authority. I asked what happens when it activates. He did not answer immediately. He looked down at the papers, then back at me, and said, "This is the part you need to hear with a clear head." He said if the court finds that a party knowingly initiated a bad faith claim tied to that agreement for the purpose of forcing a transfer, the agreement allows the harmed successor, me, to shift legal responsibility for the resulting costs and liabilities onto the initiating party. Not a slap on the wrist, not a symbolic penalty. The kind of responsibility that follows you until it is satisfied. I felt my pulse in my wrists. I asked if he was saying my mother could end up legally on the hook for what she started. He nodded once. He said, "That is exactly what your grandfather designed." He said your mother is trying to drag you into a position where you look careless or unstable, so she can present herself as the solution. But the more aggressively she does it, the more she steps into the exact trigger your grandfather built. I stared at him, not trusting my own face. A part of me wanted to laugh at the scale of it. Another part wanted to cry. My grandfather had been gone for weeks, and yet he was still shaping the room, still moving pieces I did not even know existed. I thought about all the years I assumed he was simply steady and kind. I thought about the cafe conversations, the warnings, the stories about my mother pushing for shortcuts. I thought about how he used to sit at the kitchen table and read documents slowly, lips moving a little as he followed each line. I had mistaken that for caution. It was strategy. My attorney said one more thing, quieter now. He said your mother does not realize how much information we have. She believes she is chasing money. She does not understand she is walking into a mechanism designed to handle exactly her kind of behavior. I asked him what we needed to do next. He said, "We stay calm. We document everything. We let her make her choices." He said, "We respond through proper channels. We do not poke the bear. We do not warn her. We let the court see the pattern." I nodded, but my chest felt tight. Not with fear the way it had before, but with something sharper. A kind of grief that came from realizing how necessary this protection had been. a kind of sadness for the fact that my grandfather had spent his final years planning for his own daughter to come after me. On the drive back, I pulled over once at a small park and sat in the car with the engine off. The trees were bare and the wind moved through them with a dry, whispering sound. I stared at the steering wheel and tried to steady my breathing. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel safe yet. But for the first time since the envelope arrived, I stopped feeling small. My mother had always relied on the same tools: guilt, pressure, urgency, the insistence that she knew better. Those tools worked best when I doubted myself, when I scrambled to fix things before they broke. My grandfather had built something that required the opposite of scrambling. It required patience. It required me to stand still and let her reveal herself. When I got back to the house, I found a message from my mother waiting on my phone. It was short. She asked if I had spoken to the attorney. She said she was worried the situation could get out of hand. She said we should talk. Just the two of us. Like family. I held the phone in my hand for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the call button. The old instinct rose up, the one that wanted to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to do anything that might make her less angry. Then I remembered her folder on my coffee table. I remembered her husband's voice saying trust the process as if trust were owed. I remembered the way she left without a goodbye when I refused to sign. I did not call her. I typed a response twice and deleted it twice. Anything I said would become fuel. She would twist it, soften it, or weaponize it depending on what served her. Silence, I realized, was not just strategy. It was a boundary she could not rewrite. That night, I sat at the kitchen table in my grandfather's house, the same table where he had taught me to read fine print and listen for what people avoided saying. I ran my finger along a small nick in the wood, a mark from some long-forgotten project, and felt my throat tighten. I wished he were there, not to fix this, not to fight it, just to sit across from me with his quiet presence and let the world feel steady again. Outside, a car passed and its headlights swept briefly across the window, bright, then gone. The house settled around me. I felt tired, but not lost. In the morning, we would file our response. Soon there would be hearings, dates, procedures that pretended emotion did not exist. And then, if my attorney was right, the moment would come when the court would read the language my grandfather had hidden in plain sight. I pictured that courtroom again, the way the judge's voice had slowed at the bottom of the page, the way my mother's face had started to change before the sentence was even finished. The final line was not just a warning, it was a door. And my mother was already walking toward it. The courthouse looked different when I walked up the steps that morning, not because it had changed, but because I had. The stone facade rose in front of me, solid and indifferent, the kind of building that had seen generations of people walk in believing they were right. I paused for a moment at the bottom of the stairs, my hand resting lightly on the railing, and took a slow breath before going inside. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper and floor cleaner. Shoes echoed softly against tile as people moved past one another, each carrying their own version of worry. I spotted my attorney near the courtroom door, his posture relaxed in a way that felt intentional. He nodded once when he saw me, calm and steady, and that small gesture anchored me more than any reassurance could have. Inside, the room felt larger than it had the first time, the ceiling higher, the air thinner. I took my seat at the table beside my attorney and set my bag down carefully. Across the room, my mother sat with her husband and their lawyer. She looked different today. The sharp confidence she usually wore like armor was cracked, replaced by a tight composure that did not quite hold. Her hands moved constantly, smoothing her skirt, adjusting her papers, gripping the edge of the table. She did not look at me. Not once. The judge entered, and the room rose and fell in unison. When we sat again, The hum of quiet expectation settled in. This was not the hearing anyone had expected weeks ago. It was not about a will being contested outright. It was about responsibility, about authority, about whether certain actions had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The judge began by outlining the scope of the hearing. Her voice was even, precise, the kind of voice that made you listen whether you wanted to or not. She spoke about the claims that had been filed, the responses submitted, the documents entered into the record. She made it clear that this was not a trial about hurt feelings or family disputes. This was about whether the court would allow legal mechanisms to be used as leverage. As she spoke, I felt the shift in the room. My mother leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently. He nodded, then shook his head slightly. Whatever plan they had walked in with was already unraveling. When my attorney stood to speak, he did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. He laid out the timeline calmly, the inheritance, the refusal to sign over control, the sudden filing of a claim designed to force my involvement in a role I had never accepted. He used words like pattern and pressure and bad faith, letting them sit in the air without embellishment. The judge listened without interruption. Then my mother's attorney stood. His tone was carefully measured, concerned. He spoke about confusion, about misunderstandings, about a grieving family struggling to navigate complex arrangements. He suggested that I was overwhelmed, that my mother had only been trying to help, that the claim was a reasonable attempt to clarify responsibility. I felt my jaw tighten, but I stayed still. The judge asked a few pointed questions about timing, about why this claim was filed immediately after I refused to grant authority, about whether there had been any attempt to resolve the matter without court involvement. Each question landed heavier than the last. My mother's attorney hesitated. My mother's hands clenched. Then the judge said she would like to review a particular document that had been referenced in the filings. She asked the clerk to pull it up. The screen at the side of the courtroom flickered to life, and text appeared, dense and formal, the kind of language designed to be skimmed by those who thought they already understood it. The judge adjusted her glasses and began to read. At first, it sounded technical. Definitions, clauses, authority structures. My mother shifted in her seat, her face tight but still controlled. Then the judge reached the section my attorney had warned me about, the one tied to coercive actions and succession authority. Her voice slowed. She read the language carefully, line by line, as if she wanted to make sure every word landed exactly where it was meant to. The clause described what constituted a bad faith attempt to force transfer of control. It outlined the consequences. It specified who would bear responsibility if such an attempt were found to have occurred. I felt the room lean forward. My mother's breathing grew shallow. She leaned toward her attorney again, whispering frantically now, her voice no longer contained. He stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. The judge reached the final sentence of the clause and paused. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Then she read it aloud. As the words left her mouth, I watched my mother's face change. The color drained from it so quickly it was almost startling. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her eyes widened, darting between the judge and her attorney, as if she were trying to find an escape route that no longer existed. The judge finished reading and looked up. She said that based on the evidence presented, the court found sufficient indication that the claim had been initiated not to clarify responsibility, but to exert pressure on the successor interest holder. She said the language of the agreement was clear. She said the protections had been triggered. My mother made a sound then, raw and uncontrolled. She pushed back from the table and stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She said no. She said this was a misunderstanding. She said she had only been trying to protect her daughter. The judge raised a hand, firm and final, and instructed her to sit down. My mother's composure collapsed in on itself. Her voice broke as she spoke again, louder now, desperate. She said she needed time. She said we could fix this. She said, please, just give me one chance. The words echoed through the room, brittle and exposed. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding. For a moment, I saw her not as my mother, not as the woman who had tried to control me, but as someone who had built her entire sense of security on the belief that consequences could always be negotiated away. The judge did not soften. She explained the ruling plainly. The responsibility outlined in the agreement would be enforced. The attempt to coerce transfer of authority had backfired. The legal and financial consequences would proceed as specified. My mother sank back into her chair, shaking. Her husband stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Their attorney leaned in close, speaking urgently, but she barely seemed to hear him. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. As the room began to stir, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. The fear that had followed me for weeks loosened its grip, replaced by something quieter. Not triumph, not relief. Clarity. Outside the courtroom, people moved around us in a blur. My mother was guided away by her attorney, still murmuring, still shaking her head as if denial could undo what had just happened. She did not look at me as she passed. I stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall, the cool surface grounding me. My attorney stood beside me, giving me space. He said nothing. There was nothing left to explain. For the first time since my grandfather died, the air felt steady again. Heavy, yes. Complicated, but steady. I did not know yet how the consequences would fully unfold. I did not know what this would mean for my mother, or how far the fallout would reach. I only knew that the moment had passed, the line had been crossed, and there was no going back. I took one last look at the courtroom door before turning away. Whatever came next would no longer be decided in whispers or threats. It would be decided in daylight. The doors closed behind me with a soft thud, and the sound echoed longer than I expected. Outside, the light was brighter than it had any right to be, sharp and ordinary, like the world had not just shifted on its axis. I paused on the courthouse steps, letting the noise of traffic and distant voices wash over me, grounding me in something real. My mother and her husband exited through a different door. I caught a glimpse of them across the plaza, her shoulders hunched, his hand tight on her elbow as if he were holding her upright. Reporters hovered nearby, cameras ready, but not close enough to hear anything worth recording. This was not a spectacle, it was a reckoning. They hurried past the lenses, heads down, their careful image already fraying at the edges. I did not follow. I stayed where I was and breathed. My attorney stepped beside me and said the court would issue formal notices within days. He explained the immediate effects in a low voice, practical and steady. Accounts frozen pending review. Authority reallocated. Filings that would move forward without my intervention. I listened and nodded, absorbing what mattered and letting the rest slide past me. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel the urge to manage every detail. The machine was moving now. I did not have to push it. We parted with a quiet understanding, the kind that comes from shared work done well. As I walked toward my car, I felt the absence of something I had carried for so long it had become familiar, the constant readiness, the fear that I might say the wrong thing, make the wrong move, invite another attack. It was not gone completely, but it had loosened, like a knot finally easing. The drive home was unremarkable, which felt like a gift. Red lights, crosswalks, a radio host laughing at his own joke. I passed a bakery and noticed the smell of sugar and yeast drifting through my open window. Life did not wait for closure. It kept offering itself in small, insistent ways. When I reached the house, the quiet greeted me like an old friend. I set my keys down and stood in the entryway for a moment, listening to the familiar creaks and hums. The place still held my grandfather's shape. His presence lived in the worn arm of the couch, the scuff on the wall by the hallway, the steady rhythm of the clock he never replaced. I touched the back of the chair by the window and felt my throat tighten, then soften. The phone rang once. I let it ring. A message followed a few minutes later. It was from my mother. The words came in a rush, unpunctuated and urgent. She said she did not understand how this had happened. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said she needed help, needed me to talk to someone, to say something, to stop what was coming. She said we were family. I read it once. Then again. The old pull stirred, the instinct to step in, to smooth the damage, to become the bridge she could walk across without changing course. I pictured the folder on my coffee table weeks ago, the way she had framed control as care, the way she had warned me about consequences as if they were weather, inevitable and blameless. I set the phone face down and did not respond. That choice was not easy. It was not dramatic. It was quiet and heavy, like setting down a weight you had grown used to carrying. I sat at the kitchen table and let the feeling move through me without trying to fix it. Sadness came first, then anger, then something like acceptance. Thin but steady. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded with the inevitability my attorney had predicted. Notices arrived, calls were returned, paperwork moved from one desk to another. I learned what it felt like to watch from a distance as structures adjusted around a decision that was no longer up for debate. Friends checked in, some cautiously, some with fierce loyalty. I told them what little I needed to, enough to reassure without inviting questions. I learned how to say it is being handled and mean it. Through third parties, I heard pieces of what was happening to my mother. Accounts scrutinized, partnerships strained, invitations rescinded. The world she had built on access and assumption began to shrink. Her husband grew quiet, defensive, the confidence he wore in rooms like a uniform replaced by a tight vigilance. None of it surprised me. I had seen the pattern too clearly to expect a softer ending. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the kitchen in amber light, I opened the drawer where I kept my grandfather's papers. I reread the letter he had written to me, the one he asked to be shared only when things got noisy. His words were spare and careful, like everything else he did. He told me he had chosen me not because I asked, but because I stayed. He told me not to confuse generosity with surrender. He told me that if anger came my way, it belonged to him, not to me. I folded the letter and held it to my chest, the way a child might hold a talisman. The room felt full then, not empty. I did not need to imagine him there. He was. A week later, I ran into one of his old friends at the grocery store. He took my hand and squeezed it gently, the way he always had. He said your grandfather would be proud. He did not say more. He did not need to. At night, sleep came easier. Not perfect. Not deep every time, but unburdened by the old vigilance. When I woke, the day did not feel like a threat to manage. It felt like a sequence of choices I could make. Another message came from my mother, longer this time. It started with blame and slid into pleading. It ended with a promise to change if I would just help her make this stop. I read it and felt the familiar ache, the grief for the relationship I had wanted and never had. I typed a reply and deleted it. Then I deleted the thread entirely. Boundaries, I was learning, were not declarations. They were actions repeated until the message no longer needed to be sent. On a quiet afternoon, I took a box of my grandfather's tools to the workshop and sorted them into order. Nails by size, screws by thread. The simple logic steadied me. I found the small ruler he used to keep in his pocket and smiled. He had believed in measuring twice and cutting once, in patience, in letting the right moment arrive. The inheritance, when I thought about it now, felt less like a prize and more like a responsibility I could meet. Not because I was fearless or flawless, but because I was allowed to choose. The money mattered, of course. It would shape my options, my safety. But the deeper gift was autonomy. The ability to say no without apology and yes without fear. I took a walk that evening as the sky turned violet, the air cool and clean. The path through the park was familiar, the benches worn smooth by years of use. I sat and listened to the wind move through the trees and felt the last of the day settle into my bones. I did not feel victorious. I felt clear. There would be more to do, more paperwork, more conversations. Some relationships would never mend. Others would grow stronger in the quiet that followed. I accepted all of it without rushing to name it. As I stood to leave, I thought about the girl I had been, the one who learned early to make herself smaller to keep the peace. I wished I could tell her this part, that it would be hard, that it would cost something, and that it would be worth it. The house welcomed me back with its familiar sounds. I set the kettle on and watched steam curl into the air, a small ritual that marked the end of a long day. Tomorrow would come with its own demands. Tonight, there was only this. I sat at the table and let the quiet hold. Whatever waited beyond it, I was ready to meet on my own terms. The first time I rearranged my furniture without asking anyone's opinion, I laughed out loud. It sounds small, almost ridiculous, but that moment stayed with me. I stood in the middle of my living room, hands on my hips, staring at the couch angled toward the window instead of the wall, and realized no one was going to tell me it was impractical or unnecessary or a waste of effort. No one was going to remind me that bigger houses had better layouts or that successful people did things a certain way. The room felt different immediately, more open, more honest. That was how my life began to change after everything ended. Not with grand gestures, but with dozens of small decisions that belonged entirely to me. I stopped rushing through my days. I stopped apologizing when I needed rest. I stopped bracing myself every time my phone buzzed. Some habits took longer to unlearn than others, but each week, the tension loosened its grip a little more. The inheritance settled into the background like a piece of furniture you eventually stop noticing because it fits so well. Accounts were finalized. Advisors did their jobs. I made choices slowly, carefully, without the pressure to impress anyone. I learned to say no to opportunities that felt wrong, even when they sounded impressive on paper. Especially when they sounded impressive on paper. Money, I discovered, only becomes dangerous when it is tied to fear. Once the fear fades, it becomes surprisingly quiet. I chose a life that would have embarrassed my mother. A modest apartment, a car that did exactly what it was supposed to do, and nothing more. A wardrobe built for comfort and confidence instead of status. I imagined her voice sometimes, telling me I could do better, that people would judge me, that appearances mattered. Then I imagined my grandfather's voice instead, steady and amused, asking me who I was trying to impress. The answer was no one. Going back to school felt like reclaiming a conversation I had been cut off from years earlier. The classrooms were brighter than I remembered, the desks smaller, the students younger. I took my seat anyway. I listened. I learned. I asked questions when I did not understand something and refused to feel embarrassed about it. Anxiety still visited, but it no longer owned me. When it crept in, I noticed it like a weather change. I adjusted. I did not cancel my life to accommodate it. People in my circle noticed the shift before I named it myself. Friends commented that I seemed lighter, that I laughed more easily, that I no longer seemed like I was waiting for something bad to happen. They were right. I had stopped expecting disaster as a default setting. My mother's absence became permanent without ceremony. She tried at first to re-enter my life through guilt and nostalgia. Messages about how she missed me, about how family should stick together, about how none of this would have happened if I had just trusted her. Those messages stopped when they no longer produced a response. I did not block her out of anger. I let her fade out of self-preservation. The difference mattered. I learned that silence is sometimes the clearest boundary you can draw. There were moments of grief I did not anticipate, not for the relationship we had, but for the one I had wanted. The one I had spent years believing might exist if I just tried harder. Accepting that it never would felt like losing something all over again, but this time without confusion. That grief passed, slowly, replaced by something steadier. I visited my grandfather's town again when spring finally pushed winter aside. The air smelled like thawing earth and fresh possibility. I walked the same streets we used to walk together, noticing details I had missed when I was younger. The cracked sidewalk he always stepped over. The corner store he avoided because the owner talked too much. The park bench where he liked to sit and think. I sat there alone and let the quiet settle. I told him about my life now, the choices I was making, the peace I had found. I thanked him, not just for the money, but for believing in me enough to plan for my strength instead of my weakness. I realized then that he had never tried to shield me from hardship. He had prepared me to survive it without losing myself. The fallout from my mother's actions continued without my involvement. Legal processes moved forward. Consequences followed their own timelines. I heard fragments through others, but none of it reached into my days anymore. Her story no longer defined mine. Once, someone asked if I felt like I had won. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. I said I did not feel like I won. I felt like I stopped losing. That answer surprised them. It surprised me too. Revenge, I learned, does not always look like someone else's downfall. Sometimes it looks like your own stability, your own happiness, your own refusal to repeat the cycle. My grandfather used to say that character is revealed when there is something to gain. My mother gained the chance to show who she was. So did I. The difference was what we chose to do with it. I live quietly now, intentionally. I cook meals I enjoy. I keep my circle small and my boundaries clear. I invest my time and money in things that align with my values, not my ego. I sleep through the night more often than not. When I think back to the courtroom, to my mother's voice breaking as the judge read that final line, I no longer feel the rush of emotion I once did. I feel distance, perspective, closure. The paper did not change our lives. It revealed them. If you are listening to this and you have ever been made to feel guilty for protecting yourself, I want you to remember this. You are not responsible for managing other people's reactions to your boundaries. You are not obligated to sacrifice your future to make someone else comfortable. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of choices you are facing or lines you are afraid to draw, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Stay with this channel if you want more stories about justice, betrayal, and the quiet power of choosing yourself. Subscribe and keep listening. Some endings are not about revenge, they are about reclaiming your life, one deliberate choice at a time.